Going to actually cross now live to Moscow where you are, because we're just hearing that Vladimir Putin, the Russian leader, is speaking. Let's listen in to what he's saying this hour.
With regard to the Donbas region, clearly Ukraine does not want to recognize the sovereignty of the sovereign republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. Well, Kiev and Ukraine do not recognize them as sovereign republics, and Ukraine is not happy to see our decision to recognize them. So, what perspectives do you see to improve relations between Moscow and Kiev? What should each country do in order to resolve this issue? These are questions that we've discussed for many hours during the meetings with our different European partners and with the Americans. And of course, we've talked about this numerous times. I can tell you that if the question is asked that what should be done, what Kiev should do to solve this solution in the long term, to solve this problem in the long term, it's a historic question. We must be able to live together peacefully without conflict, without military conflict. I would say that the answer is quite simple. It's no secret. We must recognize the will expressed by the people living in Sevastopol in Crimea, because when they expressed their will, it was considered to be less respectable than what happened in Kosovo. Decisions were made by the parliament here. Decisions were made by popular referendum. No one could force people to go and vote. It was a fair referendum. No one was holding a pistol to their head. They freely expressed their will. And if that's debated or contested, well, I think people have to admit that it was a popular democratic referendum. Secondly, we can see that there are discussions with Washington and NATO and Russia. We are against having Ukraine join NATO because this represents a threat to us. On many occasions, I have elaborated on the arguments for this. In Western countries, it must be understood that the best solution today would be for our Western colleagues, so they don't lose face, so to speak, would be that the country of Ukraine itself would withdraw any request to join NATO. We talked about a neutral status for the country as well. And thirdly, and unfortunately not a lot of people are talking about this now, but I did say that one way to solve the problem of the Donbas through negotiations to reach a peaceful agreement would be to use the Minsk agreements. Everything that I said can change overnight if our partners continue to deploy arms and weapons in Ukraine. It is time to demilitarize modern Ukraine, because this is the main factor, the only factor that can be observed objectively and that we can control. Everything can change overnight, as it happened by the current Ukrainian leader, who began to say that he didn't agree with the Minsk Accords and that he was in disagreement with all the different agreements that I have just mentioned.
И все. А мы остались бы с вооруженной до зубов антироссией. Это
he should just leave Ukraine and go live in Paris or Washington or Berlin and leave us here with a Ukrainian army armed to its teeth, ready to attack. And that's unacceptable for us. We can't forget that the nuclear option is still on the table. Yesterday, Mr. President, you spoke to the Russian people and you talked about President Zelensky, who said that Ukraine might obtain nuclear weapons, that Ukraine might join the group of countries with nuclear weapons. Was this just words? Is this just words, or do you think it's something that's likely to happen? I just mentioned it. I have understood that if those words were spoken, intending to strike us, and I heard them well. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine has had much nuclear capacity. The nuclear industry is well developed in Ukraine. There are also schools that train engineers. They have everything they need in order to develop a nuclear weapon. And they could do it more quickly than many other countries. Other countries that might be starting out from scratch. That's not the case of Ukraine. They're already quite advanced. All they need really is uranium enrichment. But the enrichment system is a purely technical matter. It doesn't represent an insolvable problem for Ukraine. It would be quite simple for them to enrich uranium. And I've spoken about this. There are former Tochka missiles with a 110-kilometer range, and there is a factory making intercontinental ballistic missiles for the Soviet Union. So what's the problem? If tactical nuclear weapons were present in Ukraine, it's a strategic threat to us. And we must keep that in mind, because if we start with 110 kilometers, maybe it could extend to 300, 350 kilometers. And Moscow could be a target for these missiles. And that is what we understood by Zelensky's words, which we take very seriously.
Андрей Колесников, газета «Коммерсант».
Андрей Колесников,
Владимирович, как вы считаете,
Коммерсант.
можно в современном мире, может вообще так быть, решать силой и оставаться
Do you think that in today's world
Это вот первый вопрос у меня.
we can find solutions through force?
По вашим представлениям, как далеко могут зайти войска?
And still remain a positive force on the international scene?
Соприкосновения до административных границ ЛНР и ДНР. Ну и что-то иное.
How
Спасибо.
far could these troops advance? How deeply could these troops penetrate into the republics, the popular republics? First of all, I did not say that the troops would go into these republics. Secondly, I think that it's impossible to predict what will happen. It depends on the situation on the ground. With regard to the question of whether or not we can solve everything by force, by conflict, I would like to stay on the side of good, but just because you're a force of good does not mean that you are not a force of power. I think that the forces of good must also be powerful enough to defend themselves. And on that, I will leave you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, you've been listening live there to the Russian president speaking in Moscow, taking some questions there from journalists in the room. Some rather combative language there from Vladimir Putin. He said it is time to demilitarize modern Ukraine. He said Ukraine was armed to the teeth and it had the capacity to develop nuclear weapons as well. Well, listening to that press conference was our Moscow correspondent, Nick Holdsworth. We can bring him in for some analysis right now. Nick, there from Putin sort of some ideas that we've heard before from him, this idea that certainly Ukraine should not be allowed to join NATO, but it really was a rather combative tone. What did you make of what we heard?
He's upped the ante. There's a lot of projection there. When a Russian leader starts talking about the Ukrainians having the capacity to build their own nuclear weapons, short of uranium enrichment, which is not that hard to obtain, has Soviet capacity to restart production of Soviet missiles, Tochka missiles that have 110-kilometer range currently and could, say, go up to 250, 350 kilometers within reach of Moscow. When he starts talking about that, that is projection, because the agreement of 1993, the so-called Budapest Agreement of 1993 between Yeltsin and NATO, was to denuclearize Ukraine. The Ukrainians haven't been talking about restarting nuclear armament. This is Vladimir Putin. When Vladimir Putin says this, what he's doing is sending a message to NATO and to the West that he is prepared, so he says, to use nuclear weapons. Now, that would be insanity. He may not know it. The Russian public know it, and those around him know it. It's a very dangerous moment. And I would say that it's also a dangerous moment for Vladimir Putin and for the Russians and for the country here. People I've been talking to today, up until yesterday, they probably didn't really think there was going to be a war. Now, casually overhearing somebody in the shop earlier today saying, well, I better buy that, there's going to be a war. None of them want it. And I don't know how far Putin can push this and sustain the support of his inner team, all of whom are complicit. They know that they will not get away with saying we were opposing this. It just depends really how far this can go. But when he says that it's not only dangerous for the West, for NATO, for Ukraine, Europe, and America, it's dangerous for Vladimir Putin too, actually.
And Nick, you were talking a bit earlier on about how many of these addresses by Putin in the last few days have had a rather sort of staged quality to them. I wonder whether this one had that appearance to you. He was answering questions from journalists. Did it seem like he was perhaps speaking off the cuff?
No, Vladimir Putin does not speak off the cuff. This is all planned, been in the planning for a long time. As I said earlier, it all depends upon the response of the other. He gauges the reaction of his opponent, has a script, plan A, plan B, plan C, whatever. It's all scripted. And, you can't talk off the cuff with that kind of detail about Tochka missiles and the range and the warhead capacity and all this stuff. It's all designed to get what he wants. And actually, if he doesn't get what he wants, I would tell you something which is very, very Russian and very kind of understood here. The Russians don't understand a hand, they understand a fist. And appeasement won't work with Vladimir Putin. This needs to be nipped in the bud and now. And the bud is already growing.
You say appeasement won't work, Nick. Is it your view then that perhaps the only option the West has now is a really serious array of sanctions? Might that stop Vladimir Putin at this point?
Absolutely, because if the economy collapses further than it's already collapsed, and if people stop buying Russian oil and Russian gas, that will hurt. And it will hurt those around Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin does not live in the real universe. That's quite clear. If you'd watched the press conference last night, it's kind of medieval, isn't it? Sanctions may just work, sort of any other nightmare scenario. And honestly, the way he's talking, if this goes to military conflict, and the story, game over. So, the West needs to get united around some really serious sanctions. Perhaps, I shouldn't express an opinion, but, if that's the way to stop this Game of Thrones, this ridiculous Game of Thrones, then it needs to be done.
Nick Holdsworth in Moscow, thanks very much indeed for your analysis on the programme. We can cross now live from Moscow to Brussels, where our correspondent there, Dave Keating, is standing by. And Dave, we were talking about the possibility of sanctions there with Nick Holdsworth in Moscow. In Brussels, where you are, we're expecting to hear some news of sanctions, perhaps today, perhaps tomorrow morning. Do we know what those sanctions might be?
We've been given an outline of what the sanctions will be. So the 27 Europe ministers have been here in Brussels all day, hammering this out, hearing what the different options are. Right now, French European Minister Clément Beaune is giving a press conference right here behind me, kind of outlining what they've talked about. But essentially now the ball has gone over to Paris because the EU foreign ministers are there. They were there anyway for an event on the Indo-Pacific today. And that is where we're expecting to get this decision, either tonight or early tomorrow morning. If it's tomorrow morning, I'm told it will just be a question of getting the legalities sorted. So we know that the EU is going to target people. They say they're going to target the people who are responsible for this illegal act. They will also follow the US in forbidding EU citizens from doing business with anyone or any entity in these two breakaway regions. I don't think that any American or European was actually doing business there, as far as I know. So I think that's just like a basic sanction to kick in very fast. The big question here is who would be targeted, how high up are they going to go, and how much firepower do they want to save for to prevent further Russian incursion to go past that borderline between the part of Donbas that Ukraine controls and the part of Donbas that the rebels control, and of course to prevent a full-scale Russian invasion of the whole entirety of Ukraine. Now, we heard from foreign ministers going into that meeting here today some very, very strong language, including from the countries that are usually more reticent, including Germany. Germany today did announce that it's suspending the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That was a big surprise announcement because up till now, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was unwilling to even say that he would do that in the event of a full Ukrainian invasion. So they were sounding tough when they went in there. The question is, I think, how much do they want to save until later to maintain a credible threat on Putin to make sure that he doesn't go any further than he's already gone.
Dave Keating live in Brussels. Thank you very much.